The video begins with the text PR Plus presents in pink on a yellow background. In this video, Aparupa, a sexuality educator and gender and queer rights advocate, speaks to us about what sexuality means and also explains the various different sexual orientations as well as sexual identities.
Hi, my name is Aprupa. My pronouns are she and they. I'm a sexuality educator and a queer and disability rights advocate. Today I'm going to discuss sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is who a person is sexually or romantically attracted to. One that we see most represented around us is heterosexuality, which means a man and a woman who are sexually and romantically attracted to each other, enter into relationships or partnerships, and exhibit behaviors of intimacy towards each other. In fact, one of the first relationships that many of us witness between our father and mother can be classed as heterosexual, which means that we are often unaware of, and some of us are even averse to other types of orientations. But they do exist. And you would have heard the term LGBTQIA. This comprises of marginalized sexual identities, gender identities, and sex assigned at birth. Let me break it down for you. L stands for lesbian, which means women who are sexually and or romantically attracted to other women. G stands for gay, men who are attracted to men. B stands for bisexual, which means folks who are attracted to two or more genders. And now we know that there are more than two genders. It's not just man and woman. And in fact, gender is a spectrum, just like sexual orientation is. Um, T stands for transgender, and we discussed this briefly in our gender identity video, wherein we spoke about how trans folks are people whose gender identity or the way they experience or express their gender doesn't necessarily correspond to or align with their sex assigned at birth. Q stands for queer. Now, if we were to define the term queer, there would be no need for it at all. It's basically a person who does not want to identify with any of these labels or feel like it doesn't fully describe them, but they don't identify as cisgender or heterosexual. I stands for intersex. An intersex person is someone, it's basically a sex assigned at birth, and an intersex person is someone who doesn't fall into these neat little boxes of male and female because their chromosomes, their genitals, or their reproductive organs don't necessarily fall into these definitions. A stands for, a few identities. A stands for asexual, which means a person who experiences very little to no sexual attraction. And this is, again, a term that I mentioned in the video on gender identity. So a person who experiences very little to no sexual attraction is known as an asexual person. It also stands for aromantic, which means a person who experiences very little to no romantic attraction. A also stands for agender, which is a gender identity. So basically, a person who doesn't have a relationship with their gender or doesn't necessarily identify as any gender, and they're known as an agender person. Now, all of this might be a little bit difficult to figure, like where do you fall? If you are, very clearly cisgender and heterosexual, it may be easy for you to navigate life as well because there are scripts as and relationship escalators. Like I was saying, people may date each other, they may enter into a relationship, they may marry, they may have children, raise those children, so on and so forth. But for queer and trans folks, folks who don't necessarily identify as cishet, it becomes a little bit more challenging. And also, like let's say you're disabled, right? It becomes a little difficult to understand where you fall in all these categories because we don't always have, let's say, the privacy to be able to explore, what makes us horny, what makes us aroused. We don't necessarily have access, not all of us have access to people and access to communities wherein we can talk openly about these things or we can experiment with each other. So it may become a little bit more challenging for us to really figure, what our gender identity or sexual orientation is. But remember that orientation is not equal to action because, you don't have to have had sex with a person, or you don't have to be in a romantic relationship with someone in order to identify as someone who falls within, the LGBTQIA plus community. Now, I also want to point out to you that being confused and being curious is okay. It's a normal part of exploration. Whether you're 13 or whether you're 35, it does not matter. At any age, it's normal for you to question who you are. It's normal for you to be curious. Maybe after this video, you are curious about what your gender identity or what your sexual orientation is. And if you do, end up experimenting with a person of the same gender, or you're curious about, what you would look like if you were of a gender identity, that's normal. You don't necessarily have to identify with a label in order for you to just live your life, right? And labels are meant to be empowering. Nobody can and is supposed to tell you who you are. Only you are allowed to decide which part of your identity is defining of your identity. If you do need help to figure out your identity and you're really struggling, please talk to someone that you trust, preferably someone who is a queer and trans-affirmative mental health or sexual health practitioner who can guide you and who can enable you to understand a little bit more about your identity.
This video ends with two logos on a yellow background. The first one is a pink heart and a plus sign and has Pyar Plus written underneath. And the second one is a green and black eye and has point of view written next to it.